Good Trouble podcast, where we make it our mission to challenge, question, and inspire you to do the same. Today we will discuss the political protests that continue to happen in the country of Georgia. I'm Dean.
I'm Jocelyn.
I'm Mattia.
And I'm Alexis.
Do you guys know where Georgia is?
No.
It's on the coast of the Black Sea and right below Russia. On October 28, 2024, the biggest spark happened when they enacted the draconian laws, which were very similar to some of the laws in Russia. There have been tension for a while, but this was the time that they really acted.
In Georgia, a significant portion of the population believes that redoing these recent presidential election is necessary due to widespread allegations of electoral fraud and manipulation. The October 26, 2024 parliament election, in which the ruling Georgia Dream Party claimed victory, have been marred by reports of bribery, dull voting, and violence. The irregularities have led to mass protests and deepening political crisis. The ruling Georgia Dream Party does not support redoing the recent presidential election, despite widespread allegations of electoral fraud and significant public protests. The party maintains that the election results are legitimate and has dismissed calls for a rerun.
So, kind of to fill you in on the background about what the Dream Party is that Mattia was talking about. So the Dream Party, or GD Party as lots of Georgians like to call it, is a political party that was obviously founded in Georgia in 2012. It was created by Bidzina Ivanishvili, a billionaire who made his money in Russia and later returned to Georgia. The party was originally formed to defeat Mikhail Saakashvili's party, or the United Nations movement, mostly called the UNM, which was at power at the time. Ivanishvili and his supporters believed that Saakashvili's government was becoming too authoritarian. The party promised to fix corruption, improve democracy, and build better relations with Russia, which was very controversial. Georgia has always been stuck between Russia and the West, Europe and NATO and the EU. Most Georgians want to join the European Union, EU, and NATO, but GD has made pro-Russian moves over the years that have limited their ability to do so. For example, in 2019, a Russian lawmaker was allowed to sit in Georgia's parliament, which made Georgian citizens angry. Many people feel the GD is getting too close to Russia and hurting Georgia's chances of joining the EU, like I've said before. Recently, the GD has been passing laws that limit free speech, hurt the media, and weaken democracy. For example, in March 2023, the Georgian Dream Party introduced a foreign agents law. Many saw this as a threat to democracy, similar to Russian law used to silence critics. This sparked massive protests in Tbilisi, Georgia's capital, with thousands of people waving Georgian and EU flags, demanding democracy and closer ties with Europe.
So, to go deeper into the foreign agent law, basically one of the laws flowing into it, which was a pretty big one, was a law to ban foreign media, meaning that Georgians were unable to use media that connected to the rest of the world. And this made people feel very disconnected because social media is such a wide platform that you're able to speak to people and converse throughout the entire world, and having something like that taken away from you can make people feel disconnected and feel like they're just only going to be in their one country, and this really sparked protests. And as these protests started to just get worse, pretty much, was back to the draconian laws was when those started to be enacted, and due to those increasing protests, Georgian legislation enacted draconian laws. As said, they're harsh and they're small laws, but they really end up affect a lot. Georgian legislation said they were put down to need to crack down the protests and try and make them smaller. One example is that there's a law that you're unable to put stickers on public property, or you'll be fined or essentially put in prison, which is just one of the small laws that went into this. And then on January 11th and 12th, more than 20 media workers, activists, and members of the political opposition were arrested, and this was just like not needed at all, and there was so much controversy throughout this, and the human rights defenders eventually reported delays in accessing the detainees, and there were also many allegations that several of the detainees had been beaten and verbally abused by the police. Due to this, finally, new legislation came into effect on December 30th, which gave rights of freedom and speech and peaceful assembly. Also, the detainees were eventually released.
Since we had that DM interview with Amelia, what did she have to say, and what was her perspective on these laws that are being put into place in the country of Georgia?
Yeah, so she actually started by saying how there were apparently these first really bad nights of protest, something that she's never experienced before, not even Georgia has experienced. She said they broke out on November 12th, 2024. She described them as something so different, and she said that they were horrible and too dangerous to stay. Thankfully, she said that she was alright, and she was able to notice how dangerous they were getting, so she could leave before it got too dangerous for her. She also talked about how the police were usually calm during the protests, they were just kind of observing, making sure everything was somewhat in order, but sometimes they would show up with special forces, and this just really scared a lot of the people in the country. And then about 3 weeks ago, the protests had gotten even worse, and the government was finding people through photos that were posted on the internet, and those people were getting phone calls, having to go to trials, and getting fined for many, many small things that even something they haven't done, but since they had their face, the government just made up stuff that they had to go to trial for.
Was she in any of these situations?
So her personally, she was not, but she knows people around her, her friends had gotten these calls, and that just scared them, scared her. They had to go to these trials. She didn't really go into detail about the trials, I just know that they had to go to them. And then she also described that about a week ago, 2 masked men had kidnapped a cameraman on the street after a protest. I feel like this just really shows how scary and how bad these protests had gotten. And then she also described how the protesters are currently using unity and strike to protest. I also feel like this is a really good way for them to come together, because unity, you're coming together.
Yeah, as a community.
Yeah.
Which pulls people together even though it's a time of crisis.
Yeah.
And it seems like everybody's kind of going out there to protest at the same time and really be one as a group.
Yeah.
To stand up for what they feel is right, which is great as a community, even though it's a sad time.
Yeah.
We also had that other interview. Dean, do you want to explain a little bit more about how you felt during that and who we interviewed?
We take for granted, I think, just our phones and everything that's on them and streaming.
So we talked to him about obviously the current protests in Georgia, but kind of how the government has changed in the last 20 years, how there has been some cases of democratic backsliding, and how Georgia has gotten to such a rough point now that there are protests against the government, and there is basically military versus the normal citizen, and Georgia's become a very scary place, especially in their capital.
Yeah, that's just crazy, because looking at pictures, it's such a gorgeous country that listening to his perspective from the outside, not necessarily being in Georgia or being in the protest itself, he definitely has some points of where the country has definitely taken downfalls just from how their political has gotten so much of their attention that they're not able to enjoy the beauties that the country has to offer.
Yeah, so actually making a connection from Amelia's interview and Mr. Kofi, actually he was talking about how the summer it was there wasn't much protest, it was kind of calm, but then coming up to October where it was time for elections and everybody was kind of calming down a little bit because they were just like, okay, let's see how this goes, pretty much. He described it as the elections as fraudulent and I quote, stolen, rather than like rigged, is what some people were also protesting and saying. The process led up to the election was controlled by government, and I just find this like really interesting because like an election is meant for people to express their feelings and vote for someone that they believe in and trust in will take care of them and their country and will literally affect them. And the election being controlled by the government, basically saying like, hey, like, I know you work for us. If you vote for these people, then you're gonna lose your job.
Which is crazy because it's also like, I feel like here in America, elections are times of like almost people being scared, where it should be a time of, I mean, scared I don't think is the right word, but of like almost a little bit like nervous, like what's gonna happen. And I think that shouldn't be how it feels, and you can definitely see those feelings in Georgia.
Yeah.
It's one thing for like you to be scared about who or if the opposition party wins in your election, but it's another if the election is flat out just taken from you and everybody knows it. That's
Yeah.
a very scary time.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening.